A black CEO is mocked and forced out of a deal. Months later, his competitors beg him for help. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Julian sat at the head of the conference table, the polished mahogany reflecting the sterile light of the Omnicorp boardroom. He was the CEO of Innovate Nexus, and he had spent 2 relentless years leading his team to this moment. The final signing ceremony of a landmark partnership. Across from him, Richard Thorne, the CEO of Omnicorp, leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips that Julian found deeply unsettling. Thorne's board members, a sea of 50-something faces, predominantly white, all with an air of inherited authority, were scattered around the long table. They had barely spoken a word to Julian since he arrived. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating silence punctuated only by the soft click of a pen and the rustle of papers. Julian felt an invisible wall between them, a barrier of unspoken judgments and assumptions. This deal was everything. It wasn't just a financial windfall, it was a vindication. Innovate Nexus, founded by Julian in a small, rented office with nothing but a laptop and a vision, was on the cusp of a major league partnership. They were about to integrate their groundbreaking AI with Omnicorp's vast global infrastructure, a move that would revolutionize the logistics and supply chain industry. Julian had poured his life into this, sacrificing weekends, holidays, and countless hours of sleep. He had fought through skepticism from every corner of the tech world, facing down venture capitalists who looked at his resume and his skin and saw a risk, not a visionary. This deal was supposed to be the definitive answer to every single doubt. Richard Thorne finally broke the silence, pushing his chair back. The scrape of the wood on the floor was jarring. "Julian, we've reviewed the final proposal," he began, his voice a smooth, low rumble that belied the contempt Julian could feel radiating off him. "And I must say, your work is admirable." The word admirable hung in the air, a thinly veiled insult. It was a word one used to describe a child's art project, not a multi-billion-dollar business venture. However, Thorne continued, folding his hands on the table, "We've decided to go in a different direction. A more predictable direction." Julian's breath hitched. He had heard the coded language before. A predictable direction meant a direction that didn't involve him, a direction that was safe and comfortable and kept the established order intact. "Your methods, Julian," Thorne said, leaning forward now, his eyes locked on Julian's. "They're just not the right fit for Omnicorp's vision. We're a traditional company. We prefer to work with traditional partners." Julian felt the heat rise in his face. He knew what he was hearing, what they were all hearing. The not-so-subtle message was that his innovation, his unconventional approach, and his very presence were disruptive to their sanitized world. It wasn't about the AI, it was about him. One of the board members, a portly man with a comb-over, let out a small, audible chuckle. It was a sound Julian would never forget. A sound of pure, unadulterated mockery. It wasn't just a failed deal. It was a public humiliation. They had brought him here, to the center of their power, only to tear him down, to make him feel small, to remind him of his place, which, in their eyes, was not at the head of their table. Julian's jaw tightened, and he met Thorne's gaze. He wouldn't let them see him break. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He slowly, deliberately, picked up his briefcase, his movements controlled and measured. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The calmness was an act, a shield against the fury and devastation churning inside him. He stood up, not bothering to shake hands or offer a platitude. As he walked toward the door, he could feel their eyes on his back, a collective gaze of dismissal and condescension. He didn't look back. He walked out of the room, out of the gleaming Omnicorp tower, and into the busy street, where the afternoon sun felt cold and hollow. The deal was off. Not just off, but thrown back in his face with a public display of mockery. He was not just dismissed, he was humiliated. And he was standing alone, on the sidewalk, with the weight of his company's future pressing down on his shoulders. The news of the failed deal spread like a toxic cloud, polluting the air of the tech community. Within hours, the carefully manicured press release from Omnicorp, a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak about shifting strategic priorities, was overshadowed by the salacious details leaked from the boardroom. The story didn't just report on the canceled partnership. It reveled in the specifics of Julian's public humiliation. Richard Thorne's condescending remarks were quoted, and the chuckle of the unnamed board member was referenced with gleeful malice. News outlets, sensing blood in the water, spun the narrative, painting Julian as an inexperienced upstart who had dared to play with the big boys and had been sent home packing. The articles hit Julian like a series of physical blows. Each headline was a fresh wound. Innovate Nexus crumbles at the finish line. Julian's vision not good enough for Omnicorp. The house of cards tumbles. He watched his company, once a rising star, now being dragged through the mud. The shame was a tangible weight on his chest, a constant, suffocating pressure. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the work, but it was everywhere. On his phone, in his email, even in the glances of strangers who recognized him from his recent, very public appearances. The fallout was swift and brutal. Julian's phone, once buzzing with calls from eager investors and potential partners, fell silent. Then, the calls started coming in from the other direction, from investors who had already committed. They were shaken by the public humiliation and the sudden, dramatic lack of a major partnership. One by one, they began to pull their funding. Julian spent his days on the phone, trying to reassure, to explain, to beg for a little more time. But the trust was gone. The carefully constructed facade of success had been shattered, and all that was left was the raw, painful reality of his failure. Within weeks, Innovate Nexus was a ship taking on water. The once bustling office, a testament to their rapid growth, began to feel like a tomb. The air was thick with unspoken anxiety. Julian's team, a group of brilliant, dedicated people who had followed him with unwavering belief, now looked at him with a mix of pity and concern. He saw their questions in their eyes. Asterisk, what now? Are we going to lose our jobs? Was all this for nothing? Asterisk, he felt the weight of their livelihoods on his shoulders, a burden far heavier than his own personal shame. He had been a champion, a leader, and now he was just a failure in the eyes of the industry. And worse, a liability to the people who depended on him. One evening, Julian stayed late, long after the last employee had left. He sat alone at his desk, staring at the empty chairs, the silent screens. He pulled up an old pitch deck, a digital ghost of the future that would never be. He scrolled through the slides, each one a monument to a dream that had been so cruelly taken from him. The images of their AI seamlessly integrating with Omnicorp's logistics network, the projected revenue graphs, the smiling stock photos of a diverse team working together. It all felt like a sick joke now. He thought back to that boardroom, to the cold, dismissive glares of the Omnicorp board, to Richard Thorne's smug face, to that single, unforgettable chuckle. They had not just rejected his company, they had rejected him. His ambition, his intelligence, his very existence as a black CEO in a space they considered their own. He had told himself it was about the deal, about business. But the look in their eyes had been about something far more insidious. He was not just dismissed, he was dismissed with prejudice. The anger was a fire in his gut, but it was a cold fire, one that burned with resolve rather than rage. He could let this defeat destroy him, or he could let it temper him. He could give up, or he could rebuild, not for them, but for himself and for his team. The shame was still there, but beneath it, a new feeling was beginning to stir. A quiet, simmering defiance. They thought they had broken him. They were wrong. He would not just survive this. He would rise from the ashes of this humiliation and build something so powerful, so undeniable, that they would never be able to look away again. The weight was crushing, but Julian had found a new strength to bear it. The weight was a constant reminder of what he had lost, but now, it was also a promise of what he was going to build. Julian refused to sink. He spent the weekend holed up in his apartment, not answering calls, not checking the news. He let the rage and the humiliation burn through him until all that was left was a cold, hard resolve. On Monday morning, he walked into the Innovate Nexus office, the silence of the room heavier than ever. His employees, gathered in small, anxious groups, fell silent as he approached the front of the room. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He laid out the grim reality of their situation. The canceled deal, the pulled funding, the public ridicule. He saw the despair in their faces, the fear of the inevitable. "This isn't the end," Julian said, his voice steady, his eyes meeting each of theirs. It's a redirection. He knew this was his last chance to rally them, to remind them why they had joined Innovate Nexus in the first place. Not for a quick payout, but to build something truly revolutionary. He reminded them of their core mission, of the AI they had been developing for years, the one he had always seen as the true heart of the company. It was a passion project, a labor of love that had been sidelined in the pursuit of the OmniCorp deal. "We stopped chasing the big names," he announced, the words hanging in the tense air. "We stopped trying to fit into a mold we were never meant for. We go back to what we do best. We pivot." He unveiled his plan. They would focus all their remaining resources on that passion project, a revolutionary AI that could streamline supply chains for small to mid-sized businesses. It was a risky move, a complete shift away from their previous model, but it was their only option. The AI, which they had code-named Horizon, was designed to be adaptable, intuitive, and accessible. It was a solution for the very companies that the giants like OmniCorp ignored. The initial shock on his team's faces gave way to a flicker of hope. This wasn't just a new plan, it was an act of defiance. It was a statement that they wouldn't be defined by a single failure. They would build their own path, their own success, on their own terms. Julian's conviction was a fire, and it quickly spread through the room, igniting the embers of their collective ambition. They were no longer a company on the brink. They were a small army, fighting for survival, with Julian at their head. The transformation of the company was immediate and profound. The atmosphere in the office, once heavy with anxiety, was now charged with a renewed sense of purpose. The team was smaller, but it was more focused, more dedicated than ever before. They worked tirelessly, fueled by a shared passion and a burning desire to prove their detractors wrong. Julian was right there with them, writing code, pulling all-nighters, and living on coffee and takeout. He stopped taking meetings with venture capitalists and journalists. His world had shrunk to his team, their code, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. He was no longer chasing validation from people like Richard Thorne. He was building something of genuine value, something that would solve real problems for real people. The irony was not lost on him. In their rejection, OmniCorp had inadvertently given him the freedom to pursue his original, and ultimately better, vision. The betrayal had cleared the path for a new beginning. Months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and intense concentration. The quiet work became a kind of meditation, a way to channel his anger and pain into something productive. The office, once a stage for grand presentations and big-name meetings, was now a workshop, a crucible where they forged their masterpiece. Julian didn't think about revenge, not anymore. He was too busy building his future. He was building Horizon, and with every line of code, every bug they fixed, every small victory, he was not just rebuilding his company, but reclaiming his own power and proving, to himself more than anyone else, that he was more than a headline or a punchline. He was a creator, and he was unstoppable. While Julian and his team toiled in self-imposed obscurity, the world outside their office moved on, or so it seemed. The news cycle had turned, finding new dramas to obsess over. The humiliation of Innovate Nexus faded from the headlines, replaced by stories of new tech IPOs, celebrity scandals, and the ever-present political noise. For Julian, this quiet was a godsend. It allowed him to retreat fully into the work, to shed the pressure of public perception and focus entirely on the one thing that mattered, building Horizon. The once bustling office became a quiet, focused workshop. The energy shifted from the frantic buzz of deal-making to the deep, steady hum of creation. Julian's team, now a lean and dedicated crew, had adopted his intensity. They had a shared purpose, a clear enemy, and a powerful sense of unity born from their shared trauma. They were no longer just colleagues. They were a unit, a family forged in the crucible of their collective rejection. Julian's days were long, a blur of code, coffee, and a burning desire to prove them all wrong. He'd arrive before dawn and often leave long after midnight. His life had become a series of loops: write code, test code, debug, repeat. He didn't read any more news articles or listen to any more podcasts. He cut himself off from the outside world, from the very industry that had so publicly scorned him. His world had shrunk to his team, their screens, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. He was no longer chasing validation from people like Richard Thorne. He was building something of genuine value, something that would stand on its own merits, regardless of who approved of it. The AI itself was a thing of beauty. Horizon was designed to be fundamentally different from the rigid, monolithic systems used by corporate giants like Omnicorp. Julian's AI was a dynamic, learning entity, built on a flexible architecture that could adapt in real time to shifting market conditions. While most logistics software relied on historical data and predictable patterns, Horizon was engineered to anticipate and react to the unpredictable, sudden supply chain disruptions, geopolitical shifts, or even changes in consumer behavior. It was a fluid, intuitive system that could learn from its own mistakes and evolve. Julian was relentless in his pursuit of excellence. He'd spend hours poring over a single line of code, debating the minutiae of an algorithm with his lead developer, Maya. They would argue passionately, their voices low but intense, over the most efficient way to process data or the best way to optimize a routing system. Maya, who had been with him since the beginning, was his rock. She understood his vision, his frustration, and his unwavering belief in the project. She never let him forget what they were fighting for. They would test the AI against impossible scenarios, throwing every imaginable obstacle in its path. They simulated a global pandemic that shut down ports, a sudden natural disaster that wiped out a key supplier, and a financial crisis that sent currency markets spiraling. And each time, Horizon didn't just find a solution. It found the most efficient and cost-effective solution, identifying alternative suppliers, rerouting shipments, and managing inventory with a grace and speed that felt almost preternatural. The more they worked on it, the more they realized what they had created was not just a piece of software. It was a revolution in the making. Julian found a strange kind of peace in this intense isolation. The bitterness he had felt toward Richard Thorne began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph. They had thrown him out of the race, but in doing so, they had given him the freedom to build a better car on his own terms. He was no longer a competitor in their game. He was building an entirely new game. He was a ghost in the industry, a name whispered in the halls of venture capital firms as a cautionary tale. He had a good run, they would say, but he flew too close to the sun. They thought he had crashed and burned. They had no idea that Julian was not on the ground at all. He was still in the air, flying higher than ever, powered by a new kind of engine they couldn't even begin to comprehend. His silence was not a sign of defeat. It was the sound of a storm gathering strength. And when it finally broke, it would shake the very foundations of their world. While Julian was toiling in the quiet solitude of his office, the world outside was beginning to groan under a mounting pressure it didn't understand. The global economy, once a well-oiled machine, started to seize up. Unforeseen events, a series of logistical bottlenecks, shipping crises, and resource shortages, sent shockwaves through the supply chain industry. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a cascading series of failures that exposed the fundamental flaws in the old way of doing business. For decades, large corporations had relied on rigid, complex, and deeply interconnected supply chains. They were built for efficiency in a stable world, but not for resilience in a volatile one. Now, a political dispute in one region could delay shipments of critical components for weeks. An unexpected natural disaster could cripple production for a major manufacturer. Cyber attacks, labor strikes, and even fluctuations in local weather patterns that affected crop yields were all contributing to a growing state of chaos. Richard Thorne and Omnicorp were not immune. In fact, their reliance on a single, monolithic system made them particularly vulnerable. Their existing software, a relic of a bygone era, was a beast of a program. Powerful but inflexible. It was built on the assumption that global logistics were a predictable chessboard, where every move was planned and every piece followed a set rule. But the board had been flipped over, and the pieces were now scattering in every direction. Julian, in his isolation, had been anticipating this. He had seen the fault lines in the system. The very traditional methods that Richard Thorne had so smugly espoused were now proving to be a fatal weakness. Thorne's daily life, once a predictable schedule of high-powered meetings and self-congratulatory press releases, was now a constant firefighting exercise. He was losing sleep, his days consumed by emergency calls from angry clients and panicked suppliers. He would sit in his luxurious office, staring at a screen filled with a tangle of red alerts and unfulfilled orders. The system he had so proudly inherited and championed was now his greatest enemy. It couldn't reroute shipments around a closed port, it couldn't find an alternate supplier in a pinch, and it couldn't predict the next disruption. It was an elegant machine built for a world that no longer existed. The board meetings at Omnicorp, once a space for confident strategy sessions, had become grim postmortems. The same board members who had chuckled at Julian now stared at Thorne with thinly veiled frustration. Their quarterly earnings reports were a horror show. Profit margins were shrinking, stock prices were plummeting, and their reputation as a reliable industry leader was dissolving. The arrogance that had led them to mock Julian now blinded them to the solution right in front of them. They refused to believe that the problem lay with their cherished systems. Instead, they blamed a perfect storm of external factors, an unavoidable confluence of bad luck. But the truth was far simpler and more painful. They had built a fortress for a different kind of war. And while they were cowering inside, the enemy had changed its tactics. Thorne was so steeped in his own superiority that he couldn't see the world was fundamentally changing. He still believed in a hierarchical system where he controlled everything from the top down. He couldn't grasp the need for a decentralized, adaptable, and intelligent system that could react to a world in constant flux. The irony was a cruel, delicious punchline to Julian's pain. They had mocked him for not being the right fit, for being too new, too different, too innovative. And now, that very difference was the key to survival. While they clung to their outdated methods and watched their empire crumble, the whispers of a new kind of power were beginning to circulate in the industry, a power born not from the top down, but from the ground up. Richard Thorne was a man trapped in a burning building, still refusing to believe the fire was real. He had every resource at his disposal, every tool he thought he needed, but he lacked the most important one: the humility to admit he was wrong. He had scorned the very person who held the key to his salvation, and now he was watching his kingdom fall, brick by agonizing brick. He didn't know it yet, but the same crisis he was so desperately trying to outrun was about to force him back to the man he had so publicly humiliated. While Omnicorp's empire was crumbling, a new, almost mythical name began to circulate in the industry: Horizon. Initially, it was just a whisper in the back halls of small conferences and among niche trade publications. It was said to be a game-changing AI, a technology so intuitive and adaptable that it was helping a small, select number of companies not just survive the current economic turmoil, but thrive within it. The rumors were dismissed by the larger players as hype, the kind of exaggerated claims made by startups desperate for attention. Richard Thorne, in his state of controlled panic, heard these rumors but immediately discarded them. His ingrained arrogance and bias made it impossible for him to consider that a solution could come from outside the traditional power structures he inhabited. The thought that a small, obscure company could have created something that Omnicorp's multi-million-dollar R&D department had missed was preposterous to him. He was a king in his own mind, and he could not fathom that a subject of his kingdom, let alone one he had publicly shamed, could be a better ruler. But the whispers grew louder. The stories were no longer vague. They had specifics. A mid-sized logistics firm in the Midwest, which had been on the verge of bankruptcy, was suddenly posting record profits. A boutique e-commerce company in Europe was fulfilling orders with a speed and accuracy that baffled its much larger competitors. When pressed, the CEOs of these smaller companies would speak of a new kind of software, an AI that just understood the problem and found a way. They used words like intuitive and prescient, terms never before associated with supply chain management. The name Horizon was mentioned with hushed reverence, almost as if it were a secret key to an exclusive club. Richard's board, facing another quarter of dismal returns, began to ask questions. They weren't asking about Julian by name, but they were asking about this Horizon AI. They were hearing about it from their industry contacts, from their own distressed clients, and from the growing list of small companies who were now outmaneuvering them. Richard, still in denial, commissioned a cursory report on the technology. The analyst he assigned was tasked with proving that this was nothing more than a glorified piece of standard software. The report, when it landed on his desk, did the opposite. It detailed the AI's unique architecture, its ability to learn and adapt, and its stunning success rate in navigating the very chaos that was crippling Omnicorp. The report's conclusion was stark. Horizon was not a hype. It was real, it was revolutionary, and its creator was Julian's company, Innovate Nexus. The name on the first page of the report was a gut punch to Richard. The same company he had publicly humiliated. The same man he had dismissed. Richard's face paled as he read the name, and the memory of that day, the dismissive comments, the smug feeling of power, the board's collective smirk, flashed before his eyes. He had been so wrong. He had not just made a bad business decision. He had rejected a genius. The irony was a bitter, nauseating pill. The solution to Omnicorp's impending financial disaster, the one thing that could save his legacy and his company, lay with the man he had scorned. Richard's stomach dropped. His arrogance had not only blinded him, but had put his entire company at risk. He had spent months blaming external factors, but the truth was that the biggest failure lay in his own judgment, his own prejudice, and his own short-sightedness. He had cast out the life raft because he didn't like the look of the person on it. And now, as his ship was sinking, he had to go back and beg for help. The realization was a devastating, unsettling one. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. It was shifting, and he was losing his footing. The truth, once revealed, was a venomous serpent. Richard Thorne, still reeling from the analyst's report, commissioned a deeper, more comprehensive dive. He assigned a small, trusted team to do a full workup on Innovate Nexus and this so-called Horizon AI. He was desperate for any shred of evidence that the technology was flawed, that Julian's success was a fluke. He needed to find a reason to continue his self-deception, to prove that his past judgment was not a catastrophic error. The report landed on his desk a week later. The cover was simple, unadorned, but the words within were a final, brutal blow to his arrogance. The team hadn't just studied the AI, they had studied its creator. They detailed Julian's background, his unconventional approach, his unwavering commitment to his team. They spoke of the quiet pivot, the long nights, the complete devotion of his small team to building a solution that the industry giants had deemed impossible. The report confirmed that Horizon was not just a piece of software. It was the product of a different way of thinking, a perspective born from being on the outside looking in. Richard sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn against the harsh afternoon light. He read and reread the report, his heart sinking with every page. The data was irrefutable. Horizon was more than a match for any system on the market. It was an entirely new paradigm. It wasn't just fixing problems, it was anticipating them. It was a fluid, intuitive system that learned from every interaction, a technological marvel that was now the gold standard in the industry. The report also contained a detailed breakdown of the small businesses Julian was now working with. Richard recognized some of the names. They were companies he had dismissed as too small to matter. Yet, their recent growth charts were a testament to Horizon's power. While Omnicorp's profits were plummeting, these tiny competitors, powered by Julian's AI, were thriving. They were nimble, resilient, and, most painfully of all, they were laughing all the way to the bank. Richard's stomach dropped as he stared at the screen. The same board members who had once snickered at Julian were now looking at Richard with open hostility. Their quarterly earnings reports were a horror show. Profit margins were shrinking, stock prices were plummeting, and their reputation as a reliable industry leader was dissolving. The arrogance that had led them to mock Julian now blinded them to the solution right in front of them. They refused to believe that the problem lay with their cherished systems. Instead, they blamed a perfect storm of external factors, an unavoidable confluence of bad luck. But the truth was far simpler and more painful. They had built a fortress for a different kind of war. And while they were cowering inside, the enemy had changed its tactics. Richard was so steeped in his own superiority that he couldn't see the world was fundamentally changing. He still believed in a hierarchical system where he controlled everything from the top down. He couldn't grasp the need for a decentralized, adaptable, and intelligent system that could react to a world in constant flux. He thought of Julian, the man he had looked down on just a few months ago. He remembered the calm, quiet dignity with which Julian had left the boardroom. There had been no outburst, no pleas, just a stoic acceptance of an unfair rejection. That calm was now a phantom haunting Richard's every waking moment. Julian had known, on some level, what was coming. He had the vision to see the cracks in the system, the foresight to build the solution. Richard had seen only a rival, a man he could belittle to secure his own fragile sense of superiority. The pain of this realization was a cold, quiet agony. Richard was not just facing a business crisis. He was facing a moral one. His pride had cost his company dearly, and now, the only way to save it was to go back to the man he had scorned, the man he had called not the right fit. He had to look Julian in the eye and beg for help. The irony was a cruel, delicious punchline to Julian's pain. They had mocked him for not being the right fit, for being too new, too different, too innovative. And now, that very difference was the key to survival. While they clung to their outdated methods and watched their empire crumble, the whispers of a new kind of power were beginning to circulate in the industry, a power born not from the top down, but from the ground up. Richard Thorne was a man trapped in a burning building, still refusing to believe the fire was real. He had every resource at his disposal, every tool he thought he needed, but he lacked the most important one, the humility to admit he was wrong. He had scorned the very person who held the key to his salvation, and now he was watching his kingdom fall, brick by agonizing brick. He didn't know it yet, but the same crisis he was so desperately trying to outrun was about to force him back to the man he had so publicly humiliated. The unsettling realization was a final, painful slap in the face. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Julian was in his element, a hoodie-clad CEO, sitting with his team and debating a minor bug in the Horizon AI's data parsing protocol. His phone, which he kept on silent most of the time, buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, but something made him glance at the screen. The caller ID read, Richard Thorne, Omnicorp. A tense silence fell over the room. His team, who had been watching the evolution of the news about Omnicorp's struggles, looked at Julian with a mix of anticipation and satisfaction. They knew what this call meant. It was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment of sweet, delicious vindication. Julian took a deep breath, and with a subtle, almost imperceptible smile, he excused himself from the room and took the call in his small, private office. He answered, his voice calm and professional. Julian. Richard's voice was tight, a sharp contrast to the arrogant swagger Julian remembered. We need to talk. We've hit a wall here at Omnicorp, and your AI? Horizon. It's the only thing that can get us through this. He didn't say, please, but Julian could hear the silent plea in his tone. The desperation was palpable. The king was calling the subject he had cast out, begging for help. Julian leaned back in his chair, a sense of quiet power settling over him. He didn't gloat. He didn't mock. He just listened. Richard spoke for a full 5 minutes, a rapid-fire explanation of Omnicorp's spiraling crisis. He talked about supply chain disruptions, unfulfilled orders, and an increasingly hostile board. He spoke of the impossible challenge of managing a global logistics network with a system that was breaking under the strain. He was a man who had lost control, and he was grasping at the only lifeline he saw. Julian listened, his silence a powerful form of negotiation. He let Richard finish, letting the quiet hang in the air for a full minute before he finally spoke. I see, Julian said, his voice measured. And what makes you think I'm interested in helping? There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Richard had clearly expected Julian to jump at the opportunity, to be grateful for the chance to work with Omnicorp. He had not expected this cool, collected defiance. Julian, this is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for your company, Richard stammered, his desperation turning into frustration. It was a multi-billion-dollar opportunity before, and you chose to throw it away, Julian replied, his voice still level, but with a sharp edge. That deal was about more than money. It was about respect. You didn't just reject our proposal, Richard. You publicly humiliated my company and me. You said we weren't the right fit. You told me we were admirable in a tone that made it a curse. Richard's silence was his admission of guilt. He had no defense. He knew Julian was right. So, Julian continued, why should I open my doors to a company that closed theirs so violently? Richard took a shaky breath. Julian, I was wrong. The board was wrong. We were arrogant, and we were blind. We need you. The words were painful for him to utter. He was a man who had never had to admit he was wrong, and the humility was a bitter pill. Julian smiled to himself. This was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming his dignity. He had no desire to see Omnicorp fail, but he had every intention of making them understand the cost of their arrogance. "I'll consider it," Julian said, and then, in a subtle moment of power, he added, "But this time, the meeting will be on my terms. Not just the terms of the deal, but the location. You and your board will come to my office on Friday, and you will wait until I am ready." He didn't wait for a response. He hung up the phone. He stood in his office, looking out the window at the city. The tables had turned. Julian had not just survived. He had become the indispensable solution. His victory was not just in a new deal, but in proving that true innovation and character would always win over arrogance and prejudice. Julian sat in his new office, the morning sun streaming through the large windows, illuminating the tasteful, minimalist design of the room. The space was smaller than Richard Thorne's gilded cage at Omnicorp, but it was alive with a different kind of energy, the palpable hum of innovation and a hard-earned victory. He had spent the morning preparing, not just the presentation, but himself. He was calm, focused, and ready. Today, he was not just a CEO. He was a gatekeeper, and the very people who had once locked him out were now begging for entry. The lobby of Innovate Nexus, once a quiet, unassuming space, was filled with the anxious energy of Omnicorp's delegation. Richard Thorne, looking more haggard than Julian remembered, stood with the same board members who had once snickered at him. Their faces, once smug, were now a mixture of apprehension and forced politeness. Julian had made them wait for a full 10 minutes before sending his assistant to escort them to the conference room. It was a small but significant act of defiance, a subtle reminder of who was in control. When Julian finally walked into the room, he was met with silence. The same board members who had once filled the air with condescending whispers were now silent and attentive. Richard laid out their desperate situation, acknowledging, without Julian having to say it, their past mistake. He spoke of their operational failures, their plummeting profits, and the existential threat to their company. He spoke of the reports that had hailed Horizon as the only solution, and his voice, once so full of contempt, now held a note of genuine, painful humility. Julian listened patiently. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand an apology. He just let them speak. He watched them squirm in their expensive suits, their confidence replaced by desperation. When Richard finished, the room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Julian broke it with a simple, direct question. "What do you need from me?" Richard and his board looked at each other, and then a board member, a man named Henderson, a portly figure with a receding hairline who had been the most vocal of the lot during the last meeting, cleared his throat. "We need full integration of Horizon into our global logistics network," he said, his voice clipped and efficient. "A complete, end-to-end solution." Julian nodded slowly. "And what are you prepared to offer?" They presented their offer, a lucrative, multi-million-dollar contract, a significant equity stake in Omnicorp, and a seat on the board for Julian. It was a staggering proposal, far more generous than the original deal they had scuttled. But for Julian, it wasn't about the money. "Your offer is insufficient," Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. The board members looked shocked. Richard's face flushed with a renewed sense of anger. "Insufficient," Richard said, his voice rising. "This is an extraordinary offer, Julian. It's more than you could ever have hoped for." "I am not interested in being a consultant," Julian said, his eyes meeting Richard's with an unwavering intensity. "I am not interested in a seat at your table. I am interested in building a new table. My terms are simple. I will not be your partner. I will be your equal. Our two companies will merge. Innovate Nexus will be a subsidiary of Omnicorp, but I will be a co-CEO, with full creative and operational control over the integration of Horizon into your systems and the subsequent evolution of your company's technology. Your old guard will report to my team. I will not be a new face in your old system. I will be the architect of a new one." The silence that followed was deafening. The board members' faces were a mixture of shock and outrage. They were being asked to surrender their power, their control, to a man they had once publicly humiliated. Richard, however, was staring at Julian with a new expression, a reluctant but dawning understanding. He knew, better than anyone in the room, that Julian's terms were not about power. They were about survival. They had no choice but to agree. Julian had not just come to save Omnicorp. He had come to rebuild it from the ground up, to dismantle the very system that had tried to break him. He would not just be their consultant. He would be their equal partner, with full creative control over the integration of Horizon into their systems. They had no choice but to agree. It was a new world, and Julian was now the one who held the key to their future. The final press conference was held in the grand auditorium of OmniCorp's headquarters, but the stage had been set with Julian's vision in mind. Two podiums stood side by side, one for Richard Thorne and a new one for Julian, signifying their co-equal partnership. The air was electric with anticipation. Every major tech and business journalist in the country was in attendance, their cameras flashing, their microphones pointed at the stage. They all knew the backstory, the public humiliation, the quiet retreat, and the stunning reversal of fortune. This wasn't just a business announcement. It was a story of redemption and a very public changing of the guard. Richard Thorne, visibly thinner and with a new sense of sobriety in his demeanor, spoke first. His voice, once booming with arrogance, was now measured and humble. He spoke of the challenges OmniCorp had faced, and for the first time, he publicly acknowledged that their old methods were no longer sufficient. He spoke of the need for a new direction, a new vision, and then he turned to Julian. "I am honored and humbled to announce that OmniCorp has entered into a strategic collaboration with Innovate Nexus," he said, his eyes meeting Julian's. "Julian is not just a partner in this venture. He is the architect of our future." The words were painful for Richard to say, but he said them with an air of respect that was entirely new. Then, Julian took the podium. He didn't speak of revenge or vindication. He didn't dwell on the past. He spoke of the future. He spoke of Horizon, the AI that had been born from a need for resilience and adaptability. He spoke of a new era of logistics, one that was not about brute force, but about intelligent, dynamic solutions. He spoke about the power of innovation, of diverse perspectives, and of building a system that was not just profitable, but also fundamentally better for the world. His message was not one of victory over a rival, but one of a new beginning for an entire industry. As the partnership was announced, not as a desperate plea from OmniCorp, but as a strategic collaboration between two industry leaders, the news spread like wildfire. Julian's face was on the front of every major tech magazine, hailed as a visionary who had not only survived a crisis, but had created the very solution the industry needed. The headlines had a new tone. "The visionary returns. Innovate Nexus and OmniCorp forge a new path. Julian, the CEO who redefined an industry." The narrative was no longer about his failure. It was about his triumph. Innovate Nexus, once on the brink of collapse, became a powerhouse. The infusion of capital from OmniCorp, combined with Julian's creative control, allowed them to expand their operations at a dizzying pace. The company that had been a quiet workshop was now a bustling hub of activity, attracting the brightest minds in the field. Julian, a CEO who had been mocked, was now universally respected. His victory was not just in a new deal, but in proving that true innovation and character would always win over arrogance and prejudice. He had not just saved his company, but he had also reshaped an entire industry. The old guard, represented by OmniCorp's board, had been forced to cede control, to accept that the future was not theirs to dictate. Julian's success was a beacon for others who had been told they were not the right fit. He proved that the only fit that mattered was the one you created for yourself. The ending of the story was not just happy for Julian and his team. It was a testament to a new way of doing business, a way that valued resilience, intelligence, and dignity above all else. He had been a champion, a leader, and now he was an icon. And as he looked at Richard Thorne and the OmniCorp board, he knew that his victory was not just a win for him, but a win for all those who had ever been told they were not good enough.